Just say it, man. Don't make me ask 20 questions.
What is the point?
Get to the point.
Just say it already.
Welcome to the Podcram. How about you listen to Mark Manson interview Nir Eyal? Eyal?
Mark Manson.
Welcome, my friend Nir Eyal, my old friend. For people who aren't familiar with him, Nir is an author, a technologist, a former startup founder, an investor. But most importantly, you're most well known for writing about distraction, what you call behavior design, managing your focus, attention, and all the distractions in your lives. So take us through what you have 4 keys of indistractability, or four factors of indistractability. Like, take us through each one of those one by one. What are they? Why do they matter? Is there a specific order that we should go in? What's your approach?
Sure. So let's start with, let's back up. What is distraction? Let's start with some definitions here. So the best way to understand what distraction is to understand what distraction is not. What is the opposite of distraction? Most people, if you ask them what's the opposite of distraction, they'll say focus, right? I don't want to be distracted. I want to be focused. That's not exactly right. The opposite of distraction is not focus. If you look at the origin of the word, the opposite of distraction is traction. Of course it is, right? Traction and distraction, they're opposites. So traction and distraction both end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N. That spells action, reminding us that distraction is not something that happens to you, okay? It is an action that you yourself took. So traction, by definition, is any action that pulls you towards what you said you were going to do, things that you do with intent, things that move you closer to your values and help you become the kind of person you want to become. Those are acts of traction. The opposite, distraction, is anything that is not what you plan to do in advance, something that pulls you away from your values, further away from becoming the person you want to become. So this isn't just semantics. This is really, really important, because the difference between traction and distraction is one word, and that one word is intent. As Dorothy Parker said, the time you plan to waste is not wasted time, right? Why is playing video games morally inferior to watching golf on TV? I don't know the difference. If that's what you want to do with your time, fine. Stop worrying about, how other people spend their time. Ask yourself, how do you want to spend your time in accordance with your values? So if you plan for that, if that's what you said you were going to do in advance, is play video games or go on social media or watch YouTube videos, awesome. Do it. Enjoy it. Don't feel guilty about it. But do it on your schedule and according to your values, not someone else's, certainly not the tech company's schedule. Conversely, just because something is a work-related task doesn't mean it's not a distraction. So I'll give you a perfect example in my own life. For years, I would sit down at my desk and I would say, okay, I'm going to get started. I'm going to work on that big, important project that I've been delaying and procrastinating on. Nothing's going to get in my way. I'm not going to get distracted. Here I go. I'm going to get started. But first, let me check some email. Right? Let me just scroll that Slack channel. Let me just catch up on industry news, because that's a work-related task. I'm being productive, right? But if it's not what I said I was going to do in advance, it's just as much of a distraction as playing Candy Crush or whatever, stupid activity might distract you. So if it's not what you said you're going to do in advance, it is by definition a distraction. Okay, so now to frame this model, you've got traction, you've got distraction. Now what prompts us to take these actions? We have 2 kinds of triggers. So think of them as 2 arrows bisecting here. So the usual suspects are what we call external triggers. External triggers are the pings, the dings, the rings, anything in our outside environment that can lead us towards traction or distraction. Now, that's what people tend to blame, right? They tend to say, oh, I was planning to do something and then my phone rang and I got distracted. Those are called external triggers, but they only account for 10% of our distractions. There's been many studies on this. Only 10% of the time that you check your phone is it because of a ping, ding, or ring, an external trigger. So what's the other 90%? Turns out, studies find, that 90% of the time that we get distracted, it's not because of what's happening outside of us, it's because of what's happening inside of us. These are called internal triggers. What are internal triggers? Internal triggers are uncomfortable emotional states. Boredom, fatigue, uncertainty, anxiety. That is the source of 90% of our distractions. Because what I discovered, the thing that most impacted my life, looking at the research, was that distraction is not a moral failing. It's not some kind of broken brain syndrome for the vast majority of people. They don't have anything wrong with their brains. And even those who think they do, most of them are misdiagnosed, to be honest. It's simply that we haven't learned this skill set. We haven't learned how to deal with discomfort in a healthy way that moves us towards traction rather than trying to escape it with distraction. So whether it's too much news, too much booze, too much football, too much Facebook, if you don't know what's really driving your distraction, that it's these uncomfortable emotional states you don't know how to deal with, you are always going to get distracted. So now we have the 4 points of our compass. Number 1, master internal triggers or they become your master. Number 2, make time for traction. Number 3, hacking back these external triggers. And then finally, as the last line of defense is to prevent distraction with pacts. That's the 4 strategies we have to use to become indistractable. And using those 4 strategies in concert, anybody can become indistractable.
I find there's like an interesting common thread that I see in a lot of those, which is self-awareness. Because I think a lot of people aren't aware of their own internal triggers. I know that, a big story of my adult life has just been becoming more aware of my internal triggers of what has led to bad habits and bad behavior. But also I think there's a question of being aware of what your intent is, of what you actually want to accomplish. I think a lot of people, if you're muddy on where you're trying to get, then you're more susceptible to all the distractions because it can actually be a way of hiding the fact that you don't have clarity around what you want out of your life.
When you ask most people, you say, I'm struggling with distraction. I probably have ADHD. I can't get anything done because look at what's happening in the news and the elections and social media, blah, 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 blah. And then you say, okay, but what did you plan to do today? Right? What did you get distracted from? Show me your calendar. I don't know. It's blank. Maybe I got a dentist appointment or a meeting here and there. Right? But here's the fact. You can't call something a distraction unless you know what you got distracted from. I'll say it again. It's so important. You can't say you got distracted unless you know what you got distracted from. So if you can't show me on your calendar, what is it that you wanted to do? What is traction? You can't say you got distracted. Everything is a distraction unless you know in advance what you want to do with your time. So that's where this whole technique of time boxing, which I didn't invent, it's been around for decades. It's actually the most studied, well-researched time management technique that blows to-do lists out of the water. To-do lists suck for your personal productivity in comparison. There's a way to use to-do lists, which we can talk about, but for most people, to-do lists are really sinking their personal productivity, as opposed to a time box calendar where you say, hey, according to my values, and I show you exactly how to do this in the book, how do I turn my values into time? So now I can look back at my calendar and say, okay, that's what I plan to do. Whether it's being with my kids, whether it's working on that project, whether it's playing video games, that's what I plan to do. That's traction. Everything else would be a distraction.
I'm on team to-do list.
Okay,
I'm sorry,
we could argue with Mark Near.
We'll have to
let's talk about it.
We'll have to fight about it next time we see each other.
The answer they're missing is to do both. You should box your time off with alarm clocks and have sequential checklists within each block.
Children in the Anglosphere are severely deficient in what we call psychological nutrients. And so psychological nutrients, that's kind of the name I gave these 3 elements of self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is the most widely accepted theory of human flourishing and motivation. Every psychiatrist and psychologist on the face of the earth knows self-determination. It's been around since the 1970s. And self-determination theory says that every human being, in order to have proper mental health and wellness, needs 3 things. We need competency, autonomy, and relatedness.
Thanks for listening to this installment of The Podgram. I hope it contains something useful for you. If you enjoyed these selections and are curious about the curator's own thoughts, you can check out my other podcast, Psychic Lube, where I share concise concepts meant to grease the intellectual gears and help get your creative juices flowing. Each episode is an ongoing collaborative project that welcomes listeners to expand or rebut its points by email or comment, the most interesting of which get incorporated through periodic re-recordings. As always, if you're intrigued by today's content, I encourage you to go listen to the full podcast in its original form directly from its creators so that their sponsors keep paying them to make stuff for us and nobody feels compelled to sue me for copyright infringement. Now, get off your phone and go do smart stuff. Have a productive day.